You're watching Reason and Theology, a show dedicated to evangelizing non-Catholics and helping Catholics better understand their faith.
Because we see that in our Bibles. It doesn't matter what Bible you open, Mark 16 verses 9 through 20 will be there. Now, it may be in brackets, it may be in smaller print, there may be a marginal note that says it's not in the oldest and best manuscripts, but it's still there. I call that a tradition of timidity. And that's because with our first Greek New Testament published on a printing press, the one by Erasmus back in March of 1516, he included the long ending of Mark's gospel, as well as the story of the woman caught in adultery. Now, Erasmus, in his annotations, said, I'm not really sure about these. There's patristic evidence against them, but he still included it in his Greek New Testament. Those annotations have been largely forgotten. It's his Greek text that has been well known. That Greek text stands almost directly behind the King James Bible, done almost 100 years later, 1611. The King James Bible has the long ending of Mark, and it has the story of the woman caught in adultery. These are the only two textual problems or textual variants in the entire New Testament that are more than 2 verses long, and both of them are 12 verses long. So let me just focus on the Mark 16 one. There have been some translations that were done where the scholars said, look, we're convinced this is not authentic, so let's dump it into the footnotes, not even have it in the text. And guess what happened? People who were used to seeing that in their Bible said, wait a minute, where's this long ending of Mark? We may not like it. We may not like the idea of picking up snakes and drinking poison and all this, but that's what the Bible says. So you're just getting rid of these statements in Scripture. You're anti-miracle or something like that. So they couldn't sell the Bibles. So Bibles have had to go in a different direction. With the Net Bible, I was the senior New Testament editor for the Net Bible, and we kept it in the text, but we reduced the font size by 2 points to make it harder to read from the pulpit. And we also put it in brackets with a lengthy footnote as to why we don't think it's authentic. So let me get into some of the reasons. First of all, the external evidence, I think, is very compellingly against it. Our two oldest and what most scholars, not all, of course, but what most scholars would regard as our very best manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both from the middle of the 4th century. Both of them lack the long ending of Mark's gospel. Now, Codex Vaticanus has a very interesting thing. It's got these little double dots in the margins in about 700 places they look like an umlaut or a diaresis or when the way the British write the word cooperation, where you get those 2 dots over the second O. Codex Vaticanus has these 2 dots in the margin that a scholar by the name of Philip Payne discovered about 25 years ago were an indication of a known textual variant by the scribe. Now, scholars have debated that, whether that original scribe from the 4th century knew about these variants or not, but with all the debate, still, there is a consensus that those double dots represent knowledge of a textual variant at that place. Here's the interesting thing. There are no double dots at Mark 16:8. It ends at Mark 16:8. There are no double dots there in Vaticanus, which means that if there were, we might say, hey, the scribe knew about it. We cannot say that the scribe knew about the long ending or did not, but at least we can say that there is no evidence that the scribe knew the long ending. Okay, now we have other ancient versions as well, like the Georgian and Armenian and Sahidic Coptic and others, were the earliest manuscripts. In the case of Armenian, the 99 earliest manuscripts have nothing after Mark 16:8. We have some manuscripts that put an asterisk in the margin, which indicates doubt about the authenticity of what follows, even though they have it. So here you're reading this manuscript, and it has it in there, but that asterisk has the same function as modern translations that say the oldest and best manuscripts don't have this. The ancients would understand that there's dispute about it. Modern readers hardly even look at the marginal notes. And so, when Bart Ehrman goes public and he gets on the Stephen Colbert show and others like that, he's done a shock show where he says, the story of the woman caught in adultery probably was added to John's gospel later. And everybody gets, oh my gosh, really Chicken Little kind of an attitude. They look at any Bible, they're going to have it in the marginal note. This was probably added later. It's not found in the oldest and best manuscript, something like that. It's just evidence. People don't read those marginal notes. So it's probably that they've just heard about the woman caught in adultery, but they've never really read the Bible. That's true. All right. So you've got that. You also have some manuscripts that say that Eusebius, the church father I mentioned earlier, canonized to Mark 16:8. But other manuscripts add the following. And so there's that marginal note where just a few manuscripts, but that go on and say, but other manuscripts add verses 9 through 20. And what do they mean by Eusebius canonized it to here? Well, Eusebius wrote what's called the Eusebian canons, where he showed parallels between the various gospels. And that is an ingenious system that you still find in the front of printed Greek New Testaments from time to time. And what he was doing was showing if there's a parallel here in Mark, we find that it has parallel in Luke and Matthew, and all by a numerical system. It's just brilliant, absolutely amazing. Long before chapter and verse divisions. But there was nothing that Eusebius has from verses 9 through 20. And he even went so far as to say, I've looked at a great number of manuscripts, and I can hardly find these last 12 verses. Of course, they didn't call them that. They didn't have verse numbers yet. But I can hardly find this material in any manuscripts that I've ever looked at. Well, Eusebius had Constantine, the power of the Roman emperor behind him, to produce 50 Bibles for Byzantium or Constantinople. And you would think he would have access to a number of manuscripts. He had Origen's old library, Origen from the 3rd century, from Egypt. The man had just an incredible library of these ancient books. And you're saying, I can't find this in hardly any manuscripts. That's in the early 4th century. In the late 4th century, we get Jerome, who now has the Vatican behind him. And he's doing a translation of the Bible into Latin. And he says, there's hardly a Greek manuscript that has anything past verse 8. When you get to the 5th and 6th century, now it starts to come out that there's more and more manuscripts that do have this. But we don't have manuscripts quite that early, except just a couple that actually have the long ending. But what's happened is a patristic writer by the name of Victor of Antioch wrote a commentary, either late 5th or 6th century. It was the first commentary ever on the Gospel of Mark. And he included the long ending in that commentary. And what he said is, it sounds like it's fairly evenly distributed between which manuscripts have it, which don't. But today, the great majority of manuscripts do have the long ending. In terms of Greek manuscripts, we only have 2 that lack it, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. So what was the majority in the 4th century is certainly not the majority today. And so you can't count noses and say, well, this is in the majority text, that's not going to work. It doesn't work with Eusebius. It doesn't work with Jerome, even though Jerome put it into his Latin Vulgate. But he said, I have serious doubts about its authenticity. So that's all that external evidence. And then when you look at the internal evidence, is it likely that Mark would have written this? It just doesn't line up. There have been some scholars who've tried to demonstrate this, but one of my doctoral students, a man by the name of Greg Sapaw, did his PhD dissertation on the wording, the vocabulary, the syntax, the theological motifs, the literary motifs in the long ending of Mark's gospel, and he compared it to some other endings that you probably don't even know about. And his conclusion was the evidence is overwhelming. This stuff is not authentic. It doesn't match what Mark has written elsewhere. So when I look at all this evidence, I'll mention one other thing. There's actually 5 different endings for Mark's gospel. Did you know that? You knew the 2. It ends at verse 8 or it ends at verse 20. But then there's in one manuscript called the Freer insertion, or named after Charles Freer, the guy who discovered or purchased this manuscript in the early 20th century. Codex W. It's now at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. It has a lengthy section, about a paragraph in length, between Mark 16, verse 14, and Mark 16, verse 15. Jerome mentions it. He says, I find this in some manuscripts. We did not know of any manuscripts until the beginning of last century when a manuscript was actually produced that had what Jerome had discovered. And so that's a second ending. There's also a really very vanilla ending where the disciples find out, they hear Jesus preach and he says, go and give the news to everybody. It's a really vanilla ending. And it's not nearly as interesting and as rich as verses 9 through 20. It's one of these, really, I'm yawning just listening to this. That ending is called the intermediate ending, or the shortest one ends at verse 8, but this intermediate ending, who would put that ending into the gospel if they already had verses 9 through 20? Bruce Metzger, one of the great textual scholars of the 20th century, said, no one. You put that in only if you don't have those last 12 verses. Now, it just so happens in the manuscripts where we have both of those endings, that intermediate ending always comes before verses 9 through 20, which suggests that in the tradition, somebody is copying, they find this intermediate ending, they put it in, and then they find the longer ending. And the basic scribal rule was, if in doubt, don't leave it out, So they put in verses 9 through 20 after that. So they, they're getting paid by the line. Why not? So, you have these various endings, and you ask a question: which would scribes be more likely to do? Would they be likely to drop these 12 verses that speak only in the last half of them about snakes, drinking poison, speaking in tongues, all this, starting in verse 17, I think? Or would they be likely to add it after verse 8, where if you end Mark's gospel at 16:8, it ends this way, that the angel told the women to go and tell the disciples to meet him in Galilee, and they did nothing because they were afraid. Period. End of the gospel. Now, on the surface, that is such a downer. Who on earth would ever end a gospel like that? It ends without an appearance of Jesus to the disciples. Now, the angel said that Jesus rose from the dead, so unless we want to discount the voice of an angel, we should probably believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and the women certainly did. Why would Mark end it that way? There have been two suggestions. One is that the actual ending that he wrote is completely lost. We don't have it anymore, but it's not those verses 9 through 20. Or Mark intended to end it at verse 8. I'm of the opinion that his intention was to actually end his gospel at 16:8. The arguments that the ending of the gospel is lost is that, well, this is, you have it written on a codex. A codex is our modern book form where it's bound on one side, and then cut on three sides, what a book looks like. That was actually invented in the middle of the 1st century AD. But it's also, it wasn't really picked up until a few decades later. Almost everyone believes that all of our New Testament books originally were written on a roll, or what people typically call a scroll. Now, by the 2nd century, we start getting codex form of book, and it was actually the Christians who promoted this more than any other religious group, any group of any sort. In the first 5 centuries AD, 94% of Christian literature was written on a codex, while only something like 14% of non-Christian literature was written on a codex. They were all written on rolls. So in the first, and I would say the only time in the history of the church, Christians were actually ahead of the technological curve. So, it's been 1,500 years since we were there, but nevertheless, the codex would not have been the original form of Mark. It would have been a roll. And what do you do? Well, you guys aren't probably even old enough to remember about where you could get the not DVDs, but the videotape. What's that called?
VHS.
But here's the thing: the same kind of attitude is true of the early rolls. We know among the religious rolls that we've seen of only one that was not rewound. That was one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and for some reasons it was not rewound. You go through this roll, you get to the end, and then you roll it back up So the beginning of the book is the outside. The end of the book, here's the point. The end of the book is the most protected part. So how in the world are you going to get the ending of Mark's gospel to be lost if it's the most protected part of the book? The only way that could happen is if it was originally written on a codex, or somebody forgot to rewind it, the very first one, and all the evidence is against both of those suppositions.